In a world teetering on the precipice of the unimaginable, where the familiar threads of reality fray and snap without warning, there exists a story. It's not a tale spun from fantastical realms or mythical battles, but one forged in the raw, terrifying crucible of a world turned upside down. Imagine a whisper turning into a scream, normalcy dissolving into nightmare, and the very fabric of society unraveling thread by agonizing thread. Are you ready to step into that world? To feel the tremor of fear, the sting of despair, and perhaps, against all odds, the flickering embers of hope? Then listen closely, for this is the story of survival when the rules of living and dying change in an instant. I wish with every fiber of my being that I could pinpoint the exact moment our world fractured, the precise second when the delicate balance of life tipped into chaos. But truth, as it often does, is far less cinematic, far more insidious. The final hours of what we laughingly called normal life weren't a dramatic explosion, but a slow, creeping fog, a dimming of the lights before the absolute darkness. One day, I was just me, a name swallowed by the ocean of college students, drowning in textbooks, fueled by cheap coffee, and perpetually behind on laundry. My biggest concerns revolved around looming deadlines, the social calculus of campus life, and whether I'd finally managed to understand differential equations. Then, the next, everything was different. I remember waking to a jarring electronic shriek, not the usual chirpy alarm I begrudgingly silenced each morning, but something sharper, more urgent. Groggily, I fumbled for my phone on the cluttered nightstand, my mind still half lost in the remnants of a bizarre dream involving calculus and dancing squirrels. The screen blazed with an aggressive red banner that seemed to pulse with malevolence. Emergency alert! It screamed. Zombie outbreak detected. Seek immediate shelter. Zombie outbreak. The words hung in the air, heavy and nonsensical. My first, utterly dismissive thought was this has to be a joke. Some elaborate, tasteless prank orchestrated by the notoriously tech-savvy seniors. Or maybe, just maybe, a hack. But as my sleep-addled brain slowly began to process the message, a ripple of unease started to prickle my skin. It felt wrong. Too vivid, too visceral to be a mere prank. Before I could even fully articulate my disbelief, the soundscape of the dorm building warped. A collective gasp, then a rising tide of confused shouts, escalating into outright panic. The hallway outside my door, usually a predictable rhythm of footsteps and muffled conversations, exploded into pandemonium. Doors slammed open, voices shrieked, and the frantic thud of running feet echoed through the corridors. Confusion warred with a nascent, terrifying understanding. I stumbled to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs, and cracked my door open a sliver. The scene that greeted me was something torn from a nightmare. People were streaming out of their rooms, their faces contorted with fear, some clutching haphazardly packed bags, others seemingly paralyzed by terror. A girl across the hall, usually impeccably put together, stood in the doorway in her pajamas, eyes wide and vacant, clutching a textbook as if it could offer protection. Down the hall, I saw Mark, a guy from my history class, sprinting, backpack bouncing, shouting into his phone, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Mom, Dad, you have to get inside. There's zombies." "I'm not kidding, zombies. The alert, the alert." His words, fragmented and desperate, hit me with the force of a physical blow. Zombies. It still sounded insane, ludicrous. Yet, looking at the raw, unadulterated terror etched on Mark's face, the growing chaos around me, a chilling dread began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. Panic was a virus, spreading faster than any infection. It was in the frantic energy of the students bolting down the stairs, in the choked sobs I heard echoing from the common room, in the sheer, unreasoning terror that was now palpable in the air. Someone, somewhere, had started a rumor, an official evacuation site at Lincoln High School's gym. Lincoln High, just a few blocks from campus. Normally, I'd scoff at trusting a random text message, especially one proclaiming a zombie outbreak. But seeing the disintegration of order, the tidal wave of fear washing over everyone, Something primal inside me screamed for safety, for direction, for anywhere but here. My flimsy dorm room, with its paper-thin walls and single, easily broken window, suddenly felt like a death trap. Lincoln High's gym, at least it was brick, reinforced, and gymnasiums were always built to house large crowds. If there was any semblance of safety, any hope of finding other people, it would be there. Decision made, adrenaline surging. I threw a few essentials into my backpack: water bottle, granola bars, a first aid kit I'd impulsively bought for camping last summer and never used, my phone charger, a flashlight. Useless against zombies, probably, but the act of packing gave me a semblance of control in a world spinning wildly out of control. Each step I took down the hallway was accompanied by the increasing crescendo of chaos. Screams, louder now, sharper, laced with true terror, drifted in from outside. As I reached the lobby, the scene was even more surreal. Students were clustered in small, trembling groups, some openly weeping, others frantically dialing phones, voices rising and falling in waves of panic. A girl was sobbing uncontrollably into her phone, repeating, "Mommy, are you there? Mommy?" over and over, her words echoing in the cavernous space. A guy was yelling into his, "But is it real? Is it really real? The news, is the news saying anything?" No news, just the red-bannered emergency alert and the escalating horror unfolding around us. If this was a hoax, it was an unbelievably cruel and devastating one. And if it wasn't, if it was real, I couldn't even begin to process what that meant. The sheer impossibility of it wrestled with the raw, undeniable fear gripping my heart. High school gym, I murmured to myself, trying to anchor myself to a plan, any plan. Lincoln High gym, safer than this. People, help. It was a fragile thread of hope, but in the swirling vortex of panic, it was all I had to cling to. As I pushed through the lobby doors and stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the world seemed off. Warmer than I remembered, but not in a comforting way. More like a suffocating heat, heavy and oppressive. The usually vibrant campus, bustling with students and activity, was eerily deserted. Abandoned backpacks lay scattered on the walkways like discarded toys. A half-eaten sandwich lay forlornly on a bench. It was as if life had simply stopped. I joined a small, straggling group of students heading in the general direction of Lincoln High. We moved as a unit, a cluster of frantic humanity adrift in a suddenly alien world. My heart hammered so violently it felt like it might explode from my chest. Even the sunlight felt wrong, muted, as if a gray veil had been drawn across the city, dimming the vibrant hues of life. But nothing I saw initially matched the sheer, gut-wrenching panic that had erupted inside the dorm. Initially, the streets were unsettlingly normal. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles, some with doors gaping open. A few windows were shattered on storefronts, glinting ominously in the afternoon light. But then I saw them. In the distance, far down the street, silhouettes moved. And they moved wrong. Jerky, unnatural movements. As if their limbs were alien appendages, clumsy and uncoordinated. They shuffled, lurched, their forms indistinct in the distance, but undeniably off. A wave of nausea washed over me, cold and sickening. Our small group quickened our pace, a silent, unspoken agreement to reach the gym, to find safety, to escape the growing unease that was solidifying into stark, petrifying fear. We hurried, scanning alleyways and side streets, ears straining for any sound that might betray a lurking presence. The closer we got to Lincoln High, the quieter we became, as if afraid our very voices might draw unwelcome attention. The vibrant chatter of our group dwindled to hushed whispers, then to strained silence. Sweat plastered my clothes to my back. My lungs burned with each breath, and a stitch stabbed at my side, but I didn't dare slow down. We reached the chain-link fence surrounding Lincoln High's parking lot, the metallic mesh suddenly a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. A narrow gate stood slightly ajar, and figures moved within, their silhouettes flickering in the diffused gym lights. Volunteers. People in reflective vests, armbands, gesturing, ushering others inside. A surge of relief, so potent it almost buckled my knees, flooded through me. Safety. Maybe. Hope. Definitely. They were performing cursory checks at the gate, quick glances, mostly looking for obvious injuries. As I passed through, blinking in the comparative brightness of the gym, an older woman, her face etched with exhaustion and worry, pulled me aside. A medic. She shone a small flashlight in my eyes, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You look all right," she said, her voice tired but firm, offering me water. She extended a half-empty plastic water bottle. "Any bites or scratches?" The question hung in the air, stark and brutal. Bites or scratches? The reality of the situation slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a prank. Bites and scratches. Zombies. I shook my head, numbly, thoroughly unsettled by the question. "Have there been?" I started to ask, my voice catching in my throat, the unspeakable words refusing to form. The medic just nodded grimly, her eyes conveying more than words ever could. She waved me forward, her expression resigned. "Jim's that way," she said, her voice low. "Stay calm." Calm. The word was a cruel joke in this cacophony of fear, but I nodded, taking the water bottle, and stepped into the gym. It was vast, larger than I remembered from that one time I'd been here for a local fundraiser. A chaotic patchwork of cots and foldable chairs sprawled across the polished wooden floor, taking up almost every inch of space. Families huddled together on cots, small islands of fragile comfort in a sea of uncertainty. Lone individuals, like me, drifted uncertainly to the sides, leaning against the cold gym walls for support, seeking anonymity in the shared dread. The bleachers, partially folded out, created cramped seating areas, small alcoves of whispered conversations, hushed anxieties. Dozens of faces, all reflecting the same universal dread, the same bewildered fear, turned towards me as I walked in, a new arrival in this arc of desperation. A volunteer at the door, a young man with a strained smile and an armband, gestured vaguely to the right side of the gym. "Find a cot on the right side, near the basketball hoops." I nodded, walking numbly, picking an open spot, a narrow rectangle of thin, sleeping mat on the hard gym floor. I dropped my backpack, the thud echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence, and tried to take in my surroundings, to anchor myself in this strange, new reality. Emergency supply boxes, cardboard and battered, lined the walls, stacked haphazardly like makeshift fortifications. People cradled water bottles, small packages of crackers, energy bars, meager rations that were supposed to sustain us for how long? No one seemed to know. A shrill beep, sharp and intrusive, sliced through the hushed tension, drawing everyone's attention to a volunteer near the entrance, hoisting a megaphone. He cleared his throat, his voice amplified and echoing through the vast space, each word carrying the weight of the unfolding disaster. "Attention! Attention, everyone! This shelter is authorized by local officials to provide protection and resources. We have limited food, limited water, and some medical supplies. Please listen for further announcements and remain calm." A ripple of murmured responses spread through the crowd, a low hum of anxiety and uncertainty. Remain calm. Easy to say, impossible to do. The volunteer lowered his megaphone, his shoulders slumping slightly, and began talking quietly with a small group of people wearing matching armbands. The volunteers, the supposed leaders, the ones in charge. But even they looked lost, overwhelmed, their faces mirroring the fear in the eyes of everyone else. That alone was profoundly disheartening. If they, the supposed organizers, felt as frightened and uncertain as the rest of us, what hope did we really have? Outside, the sun was setting, casting its last, dying rays through the high, dusty windows, painting long, distorted shadows on the gym floor. The combination of hushed panic, the fading light, and the sheer, surreal nature of the situation made the entire space feel like the opening scene of a bad dream, a nightmare we were trapped in, with no escape in sight. That first night in the gym stretched into an eternity. Around midnight, the main overhead lights flickered, then died, plunging the vast space into near darkness. A few portable lanterns, casting weak, yellow pools of light, were strategically placed around the cots, creating tiny, fragile clusters of survivors whispering quietly, reluctant to sleep, clinging to the illusion of safety and shared wakefulness. I tried to rest, closing my eyes, willing sleep to come, but found myself jolted awake by the smallest sounds. The clang of a folding chair somewhere in the darkness, a distant cough that echoed unnervingly, the rustle of plastic bags as someone shifted restlessly on their cot. Each sound, magnified by the oppressive silence and the gnawing anxiety, set my nerves on edge, keeping me teetering on the brink of panic. At some point, just when I thought I might actually drift off, a phone alert buzzed in unison across multiple devices, the synchronized electronic chirp cutting through the stillness like a knife. Emergency alert. Zombie activity increased. Stay indoors. The low, mournful wail of the alert tone reverberated through the dark gym, sending fresh waves of dread through those who were still awake, which, judging by the rustling and murmuring around me, was most of us. I found myself shivering, despite the stuffy warmth of the gym, a cold tremor of fear that seeped deep into my bones. Was it adrenaline? Exhaustion? Both? A volunteer, a young guy with a nervous tremor in his voice, made rounds, his flashlight beam dancing across the faces huddled in the darkness. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice strained, trying to project reassurance he clearly didn't feel. "We have the fence. We have watchers stationed around the building. Just keep calm." His words, meant to be comforting, felt hollow, almost mocking, especially given the stark terror reflected in his own wide, frightened eyes. But fatigue, relentless and unforgiving, eventually overpowered my anxiety, dragging me down into a fitful, restless doze. But even sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a chaotic jumble of flickering images, distorted faces pressed against chain-link fences, twisted hands scratching desperately at doors. I'd jerk awake, heart hammering so loudly I was sure the people on neighboring cots could hear it, gasping for breath in the stuffy, anxiety-laden air. Morning arrived sluggishly, a pale, gray light filtering through the dusty windows, barely piercing the gloom that had settled over the gym. Despite the early hour, the space was already stirring, a low hum of stressed conversation filling the air. Volunteers, their faces drawn and weary, were setting up stations near the entrance to distribute limited rations. A half bottle of water here, a single energy bar, or a small can of vegetables there. Meager offerings in the face of a monstrous, unknown threat. I queued up for my rations, feeling a pang of guilt as I accepted the small can of peaches and a lukewarm bottle of water. Guilt for taking food when supplies were obviously so desperately tight. Guilt for simply being alive when so much felt wrong, so much felt lost. We were told to conserve everything, to avoid unnecessary movement. They didn't want too many people going in and out of the building, especially given the increasingly dire warnings about increased zombie activity. We were prisoners in a gymnasium, rationing out the last vestiges of a dying world. Curiosity, a morbid fascination with the mechanics of our confinement, nudged me to explore the gym after receiving my rations. I wandered around the vast space, taking mental notes, trying to create a map in my mind of our limited sanctuary. A medical area had been hastily set up in a corner, a folding table draped with a stained sheet serving as a makeshift first aid station. A curtained-off space behind it hinted at more critical, and undoubtedly grim, medical interventions. The bleachers were partially occupied, mostly by families, who had attempted to carve out slivers of privacy with blankets draped precariously from the metal frames, creating flimsy walls in a world where true walls felt increasingly irrelevant. A group of younger volunteers, their faces etched with a mixture of bravado and fear, clustered near the double doors, their hushed conversations hinting at a possible supply run, a desperate gamble for resources. In a small alcove off the main gym floor, I spotted a volunteer meticulously organizing a pile of donated clothes, faded jeans, worn t-shirts, jackets too thin for the coming winter. I hesitated, then approached him, introducing myself. He offered a tired smile. His name was James. He had a kind face, a gentle demeanor, but even kindness seemed overshadowed by the pervasive worry, the crushing weight of the situation. He told me they'd tried contacting nearby stores for supplies, radioing out on crackling walkie-talkies, desperately hoping for a response, for a miracle. But phone lines were unreliable, often dead, and it seemed, with horrifying clarity, that no official rescue was forthcoming. "We're on our own for now," James sighed, folding a child's jacket, his movements slow, weary. "We need to make sure people don't panic. Fear spreads faster than anything else." I nodded, swallowing hard, the lump of fear in my own chest growing, expanding, threatening to suffocate me. Panic was already bubbling beneath the surface, a simmering undercurrent in the hushed conversations, the darting glances, the unspoken dread that hung heavy in the air. I just hadn't let it spill over, not yet. That afternoon, the gym's tension thickened, congealing into a palpable weight. 2 volunteer teams, small groups of brave, or perhaps desperate, individuals, departed on small supply runs. One group headed towards a local grocery store, a gamble for dwindling food supplies. The other targeted an outdoor goods retailer, rumored to have a backup generator, a desperate hope for power, for light in the encroaching darkness. Their departure was met with a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone was doing something, anything, to combat our dwindling resources. Fear for their safety, for what they might encounter beyond the flimsy chain-link fence, in the city that was rapidly transforming into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. If they returned successfully, we'd have more resources, a glimmer of hope. If they didn't, we'd be down even more capable hands, our already fragile defenses weakened further. Worried whispers spread through the gym like a creeping vine. Some folks claimed they'd heard scratching at the fence during the night, a low, persistent scraping that sent shivers down their spines. Others insisted the perimeter was secure, that it was just the wind, the overactive imaginations of fear-ridden minds. A particularly unsettling rumor circulated that someone in the gym had been bitten, infected, and was hiding it, terrified of the inevitable, horrifying transformation. The story mutated with each retelling, growing more gruesome, more detailed, fueled by the simmering paranoia that was steadily consuming us. A middle-aged man, Mr. Henderson, sitting on a cot near me, muttered under his breath, his eyes darting nervously around the gym. "If anyone's hiding that they were bitten, they'll turn, and then we're all done for." He glanced around suspiciously, his gaze lingering too long on anyone who coughed, anyone who seemed even slightly unwell, as though expecting to spot the infected person at any second, ready to point, to accuse, to ignite the already volatile fear. No official announcements were made to address these rumors, to quell the rising tide of panic, and that silence, that lack of reassurance, only amplified the anxiety, allowing paranoia to fester and grow. The volunteers, bless their hearts, tried to keep everyone calm, offering strained smiles, repeating reassurances that sounded increasingly hollow, but we could all sense it. They were just as overwhelmed, just as frightened, as lost as the rest of us. Every so often, someone's phone would chime with a new emergency alert, a jarring electronic bleat that offered little comfort, only sterile, repetitive instructions. Emergency alert. Continue to shelter in place. Emergency alert. Help is delayed. Helplessness settled over us like a shroud, suffocating hope, dimming the fragile embers of resilience. We had no timeline, no sense of what was happening beyond the chain-link fence that separated us from the encroaching horror. The best we could do, the only thing we could do, was trust, blindly and desperately, that the fence and locked doors, flimsy as they seemed in the face of the unknown, would somehow, miraculously, hold. The second night mirrored the first, an endless stretch of anxiety and fitful dozes punctuated by jarring phone alerts and the pervasive weight of fear. The gym lights were again switched off at midnight, conserving the dwindling generator fuel, leaving only the weak glow of a few strategically placed lanterns to pierce the oppressive darkness. I curled up on my thin, sleeping mat, adjusting my backpack to serve as a makeshift pillow, the hard plastic digging uncomfortably into my neck. But even that discomfort was a distraction, a physical sensation to focus on, anything to keep the gnawing fear at bay. The smell of disinfectant, used sparingly by the volunteers in a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of hygiene, lingered in the air, mixing with the stale odors of unwashed bodies, recycled air, and the pervasive, acrid scent of anxiety. A nearby group, huddled on cots, talked in hushed whispers, not even trying to sleep. They were young, maybe high schoolers who'd taken shelter here before their families were split up, their voices low and somber, carrying a gloom that felt far too heavy for their young shoulders. Another beep from my phone, a jarring reminder of the dwindling battery life. The display flickered to life, showing a new text message. "We're okay, text if you can." It was from my parents. Relief, so potent it almost knocked the breath out of me, washed over me in a dizzying wave. They were alive. They were okay. I fumbled with numb fingers, quickly typed a reply. "At Lincoln High, safe for now." But the message refused to send, the little sending arrow spinning uselessly. Signal dropped. Or maybe it was jammed, overwhelmed by network congestion. I tried a few more times, desperate to send that message, to bridge the agonizing silence, but each attempt failed. Frustration mingled with a fresh wave of despair, tears welling in my eyes, blurring the already dim screen. The phone's battery icon blinked, a grim, flashing reminder that time was running out, in more ways than one. Unable to rest, the anxiety of physical weight pressing down on me, I decided to walk quietly around the gym perimeter, just to clear my head, to try to outrun the spiraling fear, even for a few moments. I slipped between rows of cots, moving like a ghost, careful not to startle the sleeping or half-sleeping forms huddled in the dim light. Near the back exit, in a shadowy corner shrouded in darkness, I found a volunteer, Sarah. She was pacing restlessly, flashlight beam dancing erratically across the wall, her silhouette tense and rigid. She recognized me from earlier, offering a weary nod. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, the question hanging in the air, unspoken but understood. Who could sleep in this place? Sarah confided that the volunteers had received a partial radio transmission, crackling and fragmented, about possible safe zones, miles away, upstate, rumors of fortified camps, military bases still holding. But no one could confirm if they were legitimate, if they were just wishful thinking, desperate whispers in the encroaching darkness. The city was on lockdown, or so the rumor went, trapped, isolated, left to fend for ourselves. Sarah was torn, her face etched with conflicting emotions, about whether to try leading a group out, a desperate gamble in the hopes of finding real security, a haven beyond the flimsy gym walls. But that meant navigating potentially dangerous streets we knew, with a growing, horrifying certainty, might be crawling with a threat beyond understanding. "We have kids here," she said, her voice breaking slightly, pointing her flashlight towards a section of the gym where families were huddled asleep, small children clinging to their parents like lifelines. And elderly folks too. Her light flickered over the frail forms huddled on cots. "If we take them outside, can we protect them? Are we better off staying put, hoping for a real rescue? A rescue that might never come?" I had no good answer. No one did. We lingered there in the shadows, listening to the faint wind rustling the chain-link fence outside, the metal links making a soft, unsettling clinking sound every now and then, like someone or something was testing them, probing our fragile defenses. Eventually, I shuffled back to my cot, my mind whirling with questions that had no immediate solutions, no comforting answers. I lay awake, half drifting in that liminal space between conscious fear and restless, dream-haunted sleep, the weight of the world pressing down, suffocating hope, leaving only the chilling certainty of the unknown, and the terrifying silence punctuated by the sounds of a world falling apart. As the days blurred into a monotonous, anxiety-ridden stream, a bizarre routine settled over the gym, a grim parody of normalcy. We rose with the gray dawn, collected our meager rations, half a cup of lukewarm water, a stale cracker, a bite-sized energy bar, attended to any small, pointless tasks that needed doing, folding blankets, organizing dwindling supplies, sweeping small, symbolic areas of the gym, desperately trying to maintain a semblance of order in a world descending into chaos. The volunteers, bless their dwindling numbers and their exhausted spirits, rotated shifts to guard the entrances, though guard was a strong word for people armed only with improvised tools, broom handles, metal pipes scavenged from somewhere in the school, their fear a more potent weapon than anything physical they could wield. Those who had returned from supply runs, their numbers dwindling with each expedition, brought back harrowing tales, fragmented glimpses into the horrors unfolding outside the gym walls. One group, their faces pale and shaken, claimed they'd encountered actual chaos on the streets. Overturned vehicles blocking roads, eerie, shambling figures lurking by empty storefronts, their movements unnatural, unsettling. Another group, even more traumatized, whispered of witnessing neighbors, friends, transformed into pale, vacant shadows of themselves, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky, their humanity gone. Though no one wanted to describe them in detail, to utter the dreaded word aloud, the silence spoke volumes. Whenever I asked about casualties, about what they'd seen, the volunteers clammed up, their eyes dropping to the floor, their silence a more damning confirmation than any explicit description. Things went poorly, very poorly. Inside the gym, frustration simmered, bubbling just beneath the surface of strained politeness, threatening to boil over at any moment. People formed tight-knit clusters, wary glances darting at strangers in the next row of cots, suspicion replacing community, fear eroding trust. Some folks, their voices rising in frustration, argued that we should consolidate resources more aggressively, take charge, implement a real plan, a hierarchy, a command structure. Others, clinging to the last vestiges of democratic ideals, insisted we maintain a semblance of democracy, letting every voice be heard before major decisions were made, even as the world outside crumbled into anarchy. Tensions erupted over rationing policies, over the dwindling supplies of water, over the unfair distribution of crackers, over the perceived slights and injustices of a world stripped bare. Once, I witnessed a shouting match, vicious and ugly, erupt over a missing bottle of water, a single plastic bottle filled with precious, life-sustaining liquid. A volunteer, his face drawn with exhaustion and despair, had to intervene, stepping between the two arguing figures, his voice pleading for calm before the argument escalated further, before desperation turned to violence. Amidst all this escalating chaos, the phone alerts kept coming, though less frequently now, their regularity waning like the dying battery life of our devices. Emergency alert. Quarantine in effect. Emergency alert. Remain in shelter. The messages felt repetitive, robotic, as though whoever was behind them, whoever was still sending these automated pronouncements, had nothing new to offer, just blanket instructions, repeated over an empty airwave, echoing into the void of our isolation. Lincoln High wasn't just a gym. It was a sprawling complex, a labyrinth of hallways, classrooms, administrative offices, locked doors hiding unknown secrets. Early on, the volunteers had tried to keep everyone contained to the gym, to maintain some semblance of order, to control the dwindling resources. But rumors spread, whispered anxieties and desperate hopes, of extra supplies hidden in the locked cafeteria, of forgotten stockpiles in the science labs, of a magical cache of canned goods and bottled water just waiting to be discovered. Driven by desperation, fueled by the gnawing hunger and the crushing boredom of confinement, a couple of adventurous individuals, mostly younger, foolishly brave, or simply reckless, slipped away at night, vanishing into the darkness of the school, hoping to strike gold, to find the mythical hidden supplies. Most returned empty-handed, spooked by the silent corridors, the echoing emptiness, the locked doors that resisted their frantic attempts to breach them. Some didn't return at all, swallowed by the silent labyrinth of the school, their fates unknown. Another chilling mystery in a world drowning in uncertainty. One night, long after the makeshift lights were dimmed, as I lay on my cot, staring up at the unseen ceiling, listening to the hushed breathing of the sleeping forms around me, I heard a faint tapping sound, emanating from somewhere beyond the gym's back exit. It was a slow, inconsistent rhythm, a hesitant knock in the oppressive silence. 3 taps, a pause, 4 taps, then silence. Then, After an agonizingly long wait, 3 taps again. Curiosity, that dangerous human impulse, overrode my caution. Fear warred with a strange, unsettling fascination. I tiptoed silently away from my cot, moving like a shadow through the dim light, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs, and pressed my ear against the heavy wooden door that separated us from a rear corridor, a part of the school I hadn't yet explored. All I could make out, through the thick wood, was a soft shuffle, almost inaudible, and occasional breathing, or what sounded like breathing. Ragged, shallow, uneven. I wondered, with a shiver of unease, if it was a volunteer on patrol, checking the perimeter doors, or something else, something less human, summoning my nerve, fueled by a reckless mixture of curiosity and desperation to break the monotony of fear. I cracked the door open just an inch, peering out into the dim corridor. It was lit by a single, flickering emergency light, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted the familiar shapes of the hallway into menacing figures. Rows of lockers lined the walls, their metal doors painted a dull, institutional gray, stretching into the darkness like silent sentinels. "Hello?" I called out in a hushed voice, my whisper barely audible in the vast, silent space. "Anyone there?" No answer. Only the faint echo of my own words, bouncing back from the empty lockers, mocking my fragile hope. My pulse pounded in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. I strained my ears, listening, waiting. Only the shuffle, the uneven breathing, the tapping, 3 taps, then silence. After about a minute, frozen in place, listening, waiting, fear warring with morbid fascination, I decided to let it be. Wandering around alone in this dark labyrinth, in this increasingly dangerous place, hardly seemed wise. Common sense, a rare commodity in our fear-soaked world, finally prevailed. I retreated, closing the door silently, heart still hammering, and returned to my cot, the tapping sound replaying in my thoughts, echoing in the silence long after I'd settled back onto the thin mat. It felt like a warning, a cryptic message, or perhaps just a sign that we weren't alone in the building. Not truly alone. We were in the gym for what felt like forever, an eternity measured in dwindling rations and escalating fear, but in reality, it might have been only a few days, a week at most. Time lost all meaning under the constant fluorescent lamps, the days and nights blurring together. A monotonous cycle of hunger, anxiety, and dwindling hope. With each passing hour, more issues surfaced, compounding our already desperate situation. Water began running critically low, making sanitation a real problem. The few functioning toilets, designed for gym usage, were woefully overburdened, and the stench of untreated waste started to creep into the air, a foul, suffocating reminder of our deteriorating conditions. Volunteers, their faces grim and strained, tried to keep the place clean, sweeping, wiping, disinfecting with increasingly diluted solutions. But morale was plummeting faster than the water levels. Arguments became more frequent, sharper, more desperate. Some, their voices rising in panic, insisted we should relocate, that staying in the gym was suicide. Rumors of a rumored military base upstate, a fortified haven of safety, resurfaced, fueled by wishful thinking and desperate hope, though no one had any proof it was safe, or even existed. Others, paralyzed by fear of the unknown horrors outside, argued that leaving would be certain suicide, that the gym, flimsy as it was still our best chance, our only sanctuary against the encroaching darkness. One day, Sarah, her face pale but resolute, gathered a group of about a dozen survivors near the gym entrance. I joined them out of morbid curiosity, drawn by the flicker of hope in her eyes, a rare and precious commodity in our dwindling world. They were discussing whether to attempt a long trek north to seek out this mythical fortified camp, based on that stray, fragmented radio transmission. The group was evenly split, voices rising and falling in heated debate, between those who desperately believed it was our best, perhaps our only hope, and those who were terrified, paralyzed by the thought of stepping outside the gym walls at all. During the meeting, James, his voice quavering but firm, stood up, his face etched with weariness and fear. "Look," he said, his voice cutting through the heated debate, drawing everyone's attention. "I've been outside on 3 supply runs now. Each time we lost people." His voice cracked, the unspoken horrors hanging heavy in the air. "The streets aren't normal anymore. Whatever is out there, it's relentless." He shuddered, visibly, his eyes haunted. "We barely made it back. I hate feeling like a prisoner, trapped in this place. But at least these walls offer some protection. Some illusion of safety." A middle-aged woman, Mrs. Davison, her face drawn and pale, responded, her voice sharp with desperation. "Walls won't save us if we run out of supplies. It's only a matter of time before hunger forces us out anyway. We're just delaying the inevitable, rotting in here." They continued arguing in circles, hope warring with fear, desperation battling against paralysis, the outcome of the discussion as inconclusive, as fractured, as the world outside. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that any organized escape plan, any collective decision, was unlikely. People were too frightened, too divided, too consumed by their own individual terrors to unite, to act, to even agree on a course of action. We were adrift, a fractured community, slowly sinking in a sea of fear and uncertainty. A few days after we arrived, or maybe it was longer, time a meaningless construct in our confined reality, a volunteer named Marcus, a strong, quiet man who'd been instrumental in organizing the early supply runs, led a fresh expedition. This time, their target was a chain pharmacy on the other side of town, rumored to have leftover essentials, medicine, first aid supplies, maybe even some forgotten canned goods. He picked his volunteers carefully, people who could run fast, who weren't easily spooked, who still possessed a flicker of hope, or at least a desperate resolve. They left at dawn, their departure somber, a silent prayer for their safe return hanging in the air, promising to return by nightfall, a fragile promise in a world where promises held less and less weight. We pinned our fragile hopes on them, clinging to the desperate possibility that they might find something, anything, that could sustain us longer, that could push back the encroaching darkness, even for a little while. If they found medicine, food, even that mythical generator, it could buy us time, a precious commodity in our rapidly dwindling world. As day turned to evening, then to dusk, worried glances kept flicking towards the gym entrance, each creak of the door, each shadow flickering in the twilight, raising and then dashing hopes in equal measure. By sunset, they weren't back. By midnight, the tension in the gym was so thick you could practically feel it, a suffocating blanket of fear and unspoken dread. A volunteer, his face pale and strained, tried to calm everyone, offering weak reassurances, explaining that maybe they'd taken shelter elsewhere, trapped by some unexpected danger, or were hiding, waiting until it was safe to return. But the unspoken fear, the chilling certainty that hung heavy in the air, was that something had gone terribly wrong outside, that Marcus and his team had joined the growing ranks of the lost, the swallowed by the darkness. Outside, the fence rattled, more persistently than usual, a low, unsettling tremor in the night. I stared up at the high windows, seeing only darkness beyond the dusty panes, yet I sensed shapes out there, unseen presences pressing against our last line of defense, drawn by the flickering lights, by the scent of life within. My nerves were raw, stretched to their breaking point, and I wasn't alone. People paced restlessly, or huddled together in small, trembling groups, eyes darting at every small noise, every shadow, every rustle of the wind against the chain link. When the fence rattled again, louder, more insistent, a jarring metallic shriek that cut through the hushed tension, the gym fell into absolute silence, all breath held, all movement frozen. Time seemed frozen, suspended in that agonizing stillness. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the clattering subsided, fading back into the night, but it left behind a collective dread that was colder, deeper, more profound than ever before. A chilling certainty that something was coming, something was breaking, something was about to end. That same night, the generator, our last lifeline to light and a semblance of normalcy, the sputtering, unreliable engine we'd been nursing with dwindling fuel reserves, started to cough, to sputter, its rhythm faltering dangerously. We relied on it primarily to power the gym's overhead lights, the harsh fluorescent glare that banished the absolute darkness, and a few small appliances, the ancient refrigerator in the makeshift medical area, a crackling radio that offered only static and fragments of static-filled broadcasts. Without it, we would be plunged into near-total darkness, save for the weak, unreliable beams of battery lanterns and flashlights, a descent into a primal fear we could barely comprehend. Close to 2 a.m., in the oppressive silence punctuated only by the erratic sputtering of the dying generator, a sharp crack echoed through the gym, a sound that shattered the fragile peace, a sound of something breaking, falling, or being knocked over with force. A flurry of panicked movement ensued, volunteers with flashlights scrambling to their feet, rushing towards the sound, their beams of light cutting through the darkness, searching, probing, desperately trying to ascertain if we were under attack, if the breach had come. I crept along behind them, my heart hammering against my ribs, fear a cold fist clenching in my stomach. We found a toppled metal shelf near the cafeteria doors, a heavy shelving unit that had inexplicably fallen, sending cans and packages of long-forgotten cafeteria supplies strewn across the floor in a chaotic mess. Yet, no one was there. No volunteer, no survivor, no anything. No sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Just the toppled shelf, the scattered debris, the unsettling silence. Could it have been an animal? A stray dog, desperate for food, somehow managing to get inside? Or something else? Something we didn't want to name, didn't want to acknowledge, the shuffling, unseen threat that lurked just beyond the fence. The volunteers searched with strained expressions, their flashlight beams sweeping nervously across the floor, probing the shadows, searching for answers, for explanations, for any sign of a breach. They discovered no obvious points of entry, no broken windows, no forced doors, just the inexplicable toppled shelf, the unsettling silence. But the incident, however mundane in its origin, left everyone deeply unsettled, the mystery amplifying the already pervasive paranoia, fueling the fear that something was breaking down, that our fragile defenses were crumbling from within. We fortified the cafeteria doors as best we could, a futile gesture of desperation, hauling heavy furniture, pushing battered chairs, and toppling overflowing trash cans against the metal doors, creating a makeshift barricade against an unseen, unknown threat. Afterwards, as people returned to the gym, their faces pale and shaken, I noticed a long smear on the wall near the cafeteria entrance, a dark, reddish-brown stain that snaked down the plaster. It might have been rust, ancient and innocuous, or just an old stain, hard to tell in the weak, flickering lantern light, but in that moment, in that atmosphere of heightened fear, it filled me with a deep unease, a chilling premonition. The entire building, our supposed sanctuary, our last stand, felt as though it were slowly, inexorably, falling apart from the inside out. In the days that followed, or what we perceived as days in the timeless void of the gym, the population thinned. Cots were left empty, the thin sheets rumpled and hastily abandoned. Silent testaments to disappearances we pretended not to notice, fears we dared not voice aloud. No official announcement was made about these disappearances, these silent vanishings into the night. We could only guess, could only whisper amongst ourselves. Had they tried to escape, desperate for a chance at survival beyond the gym walls? Had they found some other part of the school to hide in, seeking solitude, or perhaps a different, unknown escape route? Or, a more chilling possibility, might some have been quietly ill, infected, sneaking away to avoid drawing attention to themselves, to spare the rest of us the horrific consequences of their transformation? This climate of uncertainty, this unspoken dread, fueled distrust, fracturing the already fragile sense of community. A group of about 10 people, led by an outspoken, increasingly volatile man named Drew, banded together, their voices growing louder, more accusatory. They claimed they didn't feel safe sharing resources with everyone, that the gym was compromised, that the volunteers were incompetent, that the only way to survive was to take matters into their own hands. They announced their intention to barricade themselves in the locker rooms, a separate section of the gym complex, taking supplies for their small, self-selected group, abandoning the rest of us to our fate. Sarah and James, their faces etched with weariness and despair, attempted to mediate, to reason with Drew, warning him that splitting from the main group would lead to fragmentation, to weakness, to our collective doom. But Drew, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, wouldn't be swayed. His paranoia and fear hardened into a brittle resolve. A tense standoff ensued. A silent battle of wills played out in front of everyone, the gym holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable break. In the end, Drew and his followers, their faces grim and defiant, stormed off, shouldering scavenged supplies, stolen rations, their footsteps echoing harshly on the gym floor as they disappeared behind the far doors leading to the locker rooms, leaving everyone else in a stunned, apprehensive silence. For the next day or so, we heard them rummaging in the locker rooms, the muffled sounds of furniture being dragged, benches being pushed, maybe even stacked against the doors, creating their own separate fortress within our failing stronghold. Tensions, already stretched to their breaking point, only grew. Now we had two factions in one building, each suspicious of the other, each vying for dwindling resources, each bracing for the inevitable collapse. With so little food, so little water, so little hope, arguments, fueled by desperation and paranoia, became inevitable, a constant undercurrent in the increasingly toxic atmosphere of the gym. Amidst the escalating chaos, the fracturing community, the encroaching despair, I found a strange, unexpected sort of companionship with Sarah, James, and a few others, a small core of resilient souls who remained dedicated to the fragile idea of communal survival, even as the community around us dissolved into factions and fear. We'd gather late at night, huddled in a small circle in the dim lantern light, sharing small bits of hope, fragile memories of life before the alert, before the world turned upside down. Often, inevitably, the conversation turned to deeper fears, unspoken anxieties, the chilling question that hung unspoken in the air. What if rescue never arrived? What if this was it? What if we were truly, utterly alone? One evening, we sat in our usual circle on the gym floor, flashlights pointed downward to avoid attracting unwanted attention, the low, mournful hum of the dying generator droning in the background, a soundtrack to our despair. James, his voice low and hesitant, voiced a thought that had clearly been gnawing at him, a chilling possibility that mirrored the unspoken fears in all our hearts. What if this isn't isolated to our city? A heavy silence followed his words, the hum of the generator amplifying the oppressive stillness. We'd all considered that possibility, buried it deep within our subconscious, tried to avoid thinking about the broader implications, the truly terrifying scope of the disaster. The phone alerts, they never mentioned specific regions anymore. They just said to remain in shelter. Could this be nationwide? Global? Sarah swallowed hard, forcing a weak, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. We stick together, she said, her voice strained but resolute. That's our chance. Her words, though earnest, though meant to be reassuring, felt hollow in the vastness of our uncertainty, in the face of a threat so immense, so incomprehensible. Desperation peaked, reached a fever pitch, when we ran critically low on water. The sinks in the locker rooms and bathrooms still dribbled a meager trickle of liquid, barely enough to dampen a cloth, to wet parched lips, but it was barely a trickle, and the water pressure seemed to drop with each passing day. We had no way of knowing whether it was safe to drink unboiled tap water, if the city's filtration system still functioned, if the dwindling liquid that seeped from the faucets was anything more than a poison promise. A second volunteer team, smaller, even more desperate than the last, decided, against all reason, against all hope, to head to a major supermarket on the other side of town. A fool's errand, a suicide mission disguised as a supply run. Their departure was solemn, devoid of any illusion of hope. Instead of hopeful send-offs, cheers of encouragement, all we could do was glance away, unable to meet their eyes, knowing, with a chilling certainty, that the odds weren't in their favor. They didn't come back that night, or the next, or the day after that. Eventually, we stopped expecting them, their absence a heavy weight added to the already crushing burden of despair. The anguish on the faces of the remaining volunteers, their silent, haunted expressions, told us everything we needed to know. We had no more illusions, no more desperate fantasies that outside runs, these increasingly reckless gambles, could reliably save us. But by this time, the gym truly felt like a prison, a cage of our own making, a crumbling fortress against an unstoppable tide. Chairs, discarded boxes, and scattered debris cluttered every corner, creating obstacles in the dim light, mirroring the chaotic state of our minds. A stale, suffocating odor of unwashed bodies, spilled food, and pervasive hopelessness lingered in the air, clinging to everything, seeping into our clothes, our skin, our souls. The tension with Drew's group in the locker rooms escalated, reaching a breaking point, simmering paranoia boiling over into open hostility. Shouting matches, ugly and accusatory, erupted through the closed doors, their voices echoing in the oppressive silence of the gym. Accusations hurled across the flimsy barrier of the locker room doors. They claimed the main area was compromised, tainted, infected, and refused to share their meager resources, hoarding their stolen supplies, guarding their self-imposed isolation with a fierce, almost feral intensity. They even posted guards, two of Drew's most loyal followers, fellow survivors who glared suspiciously at anyone who came too close to the locker room doors, their eyes filled with suspicion and resentment. Meanwhile, outside, the fences groaned more often, rattled more persistently, the unsettling metallic tremor a constant, gnawing presence. We couldn't tell if it was just the wind, the growing storm gathering on the horizon, or something else, something more sinister, pushing against them from inside, testing our fragile defenses, probing for weaknesses. It sounded like an ongoing attempt to break in. A relentless siege, day and night, with no respite, no escape. Once, while checking the perimeter doors, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand, I glimpsed a shape outside in the dusk, a fleeting silhouette at the edge of the fence line. I couldn't fully discern what it was, just a figure moving erratically, its form indistinct in the fading light, near the chain-link fence, just beyond the reach of our flickering lanterns. It stayed there for a few seconds, motionless, as if sensing me through the small window, through the flimsy door, then vanished into the gathering gloom, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. That night, I had trouble breathing. The image of that indistinct figure burned into my mind, the chilling certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting, just beyond our fragile defenses, a constant, unseen presence. Time lost all meaning, days and nights indistinguishable in the artificial gloom of the gym. We survived on rationed snacks, odd cans of forgotten vegetables, sips of lukewarm, increasingly suspect water. The volunteer announcements grew less frequent, their voices weaker, their messages more repetitive, more devoid of hope. Many of them were simply drained of energy, physically and emotionally exhausted, the weight of responsibility, the crushing despair, finally taking its toll. Even the old medic, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had checked me upon arrival, her face etched with 1,000 worries, seemed defeated, spending most of her time tending to people with stress-related ailments, dehydration, minor injuries, the walking wounded of our confined apocalypse. When a volunteer approached her with minor scratches from a scuffle over resources, a childish argument turned violent. She merely shook her head, her eyes filled with a profound weariness, as if even she, the voice of reason, the beacon of hope in the early days, was unsure how to help anymore, how to patch up wounds that were far deeper than skin and bone. We tried to keep the generator functioning for a few hours each night, clinging to the fragile illusion of light, of power, of a world that still functioned, even in this small, dying corner of it. But fuel was nearly gone, the reserves dwindling to almost nothing. One evening, as we huddled in the oppressive darkness, the generator sputtered dangerously, coughed, cut out for several agonizing seconds at a time, plunging us into an abyss of darkness, absolute and terrifying, before roaring back to life, the sudden resurgence of light almost as jarring as the darkness itself. Each time it died, each flickering plunge into the void, the gym erupted in panicked murmurs, stifled cries, the collective breath held in terrified anticipation. Every phone left with even a sliver of battery beeped sporadically, a mournful electronic chirp in the oppressive silence. Though we received fewer and fewer official messages, the automated pronouncements fading into nothingness. Some alerts were duplicates of older messages, stuck in a loop, broken records of a dying system. Emergency alert. High-risk area. Avoid travel. Emergency alert. Remain in your shelter. We felt abandoned, utterly alone, left to fend for ourselves in the crumbling shell of a school, a once familiar building that had become our final, desperate stronghold. 3 nights before the gym's downfall, before the final, terrifying collapse, I heard something that still haunts me, even now, even in the fragmented memories that flicker through my mind like dying embers. A single, piercing scream, echoing down the hallway, cutting through the oppressive silence like a shard of ice. It was distinctly human, unmistakably female, filled with such raw, unadulterated terror that my blood ran cold, freezing my veins, stopping my heart in its tracks. I scrambled out of my cot, adrenaline jolting me awake, fumbling for my flashlight in the darkness, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the plastic casing. Others did the same, startled from their fitful sleep, their whispered anxieties erupting into hushed questions, frantic murmurs. Sarah, James, and a few of the remaining volunteers, their faces pale and strained, gathered near the gym entrance, shining beams of light into the dark corridors, their faces etched with fear, uncertainty, and a grim premonition. We never found who screamed. The scream, sharp and sudden, had been swallowed by the silence, leaving only a chilling echo in the air. We discovered only a trail of scattered belongings, abandoned in haste, in terror. A single shoe lying forlornly in the hallway, a fallen flashlight casting a weak beam against the wall, a crumpled, half-empty water bottle rolling across the floor, leading to a side door that was ajar, slightly open, a gaping maw in the wall of our fragile sanctuary. Beyond it, a pitch-black hallway awaited, silent except for a faint, unsettling drip of water from leaky pipes, a sound that amplified the oppressive silence, the sense of something deeply wrong. We retreated hastily, fear overriding curiosity, no one wanting to wander too far from the main group, into the darkness, into the unknown. The fear among us became palpable, a living, breathing entity in the gym, heavier than the stale air, colder than the encroaching night. People whispered theories, their voices trembling, their eyes wide with dread. Did someone try to escape, drawn by a false hope, a desperate gamble for freedom? Did they encounter an intruder, something that had breached our defenses, something we hadn't seen, hadn't anticipated? Our imagination spiraled, fueled by fear, unchecked by reason, painting terrifying scenarios in the darkness. That same night, as if in response to our unspoken fears, the chain-link fence rattled more violently than ever, the metallic clattering of frantic, desperate assault on our fragile perimeter. Some survivors huddled in tight groups, covering their ears with their hands, burying their faces in their blankets, desperately trying to block out the dreadful noise, the chilling sound of our defenses failing. Others paced anxiously, their movements jerky and agitated, fiddling nervously with any object at hand. A water bottle, a piece of cloth, a small, useless stone, their frantic energy mirroring the escalating chaos outside. A child cried softly in the darkness, her sobs echoing in the oppressive stillness, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that pierced the heart, that amplified the collective despair. 2 days later, though time had lost all meaning, the gym a timeless void, tension with Drew's group in the locker rooms hit a breaking point, the simmering hostility erupting into open conflict. They stormed the gym, bursting through the doors separating the locker rooms from the main space, their faces grim, their eyes burning with a mixture of desperation and rage. They claimed they needed more blankets, more water, more of everything, their voices accusatory, demanding, fueled by their self-imposed isolation, their escalating paranoia. The confrontation escalated rapidly, a spark igniting a tinderbox of fear and desperation. When one of Drew's followers, a hulking, angry man named Carl, shoved a volunteer who stood in their way, blocking their path to the dwindling supply boxes. Within moments, shouts erupted, pushing and shoving escalated into open violence, and a chaotic melee broke out in the middle of the gym. We scrambled to intervene, Sarah, James, and a few other volunteers desperately trying to quell the violence, to restore order to the chaos. Sarah tried to mediate, stepping bravely between the two sides, arms raised in a plea for calm, her voice trembling but firm, urging reason, appealing to their shared humanity. James attempted to talk sense to Drew, his voice pleading, his words desperate, trying to break through the man's wall of fear and paranoia. But Drew was too far gone, consumed by his own demons, exhausted, hungry, paranoid, his mind fractured by fear and deprivation. He spat accusations, his voice raw with fury, that the volunteers were hoarding resources, that they were incompetent, that staying in the gym was a death sentence, a slow, agonizing demise. The argument escalated, voices rising in a crescendo of rage and despair, until Drew, his face red with fury, his eyes wild and desperate, roared, "I'd rather take my chances outside than rot in here." In a final, reckless act of defiance, of despair, he and his group, their faces grim and determined, snatched extra supplies, ignoring Sarah's and James's desperate pleas to cooperate, to think rationally, to consider the consequences of their actions. Before we could react, before we could stop them, they rushed to a back exit door, a rarely used fire escape, forcibly unlocking it, the jarring shriek of the alarm wailing briefly, uselessly, in the chaos. But the group pushed onward, undeterred, determined to flee into the world outside, into the unknown terrors that awaited them beyond the fence perimeter. We watched, stunned, helpless, as they disappeared beyond the chain-link fence, their silhouettes swallowed by the encroaching dusk. Some carried improvised weapons, sharpened broom handles, lengths of pipe, pathetic defenses against an unknown enemy. Others clutched backpacks stuffed with stolen provisions, meager rations that wouldn't last long in the harsh reality outside. Their fate was unknown, their gamble a desperate roll of the dice in a game with impossibly high stakes. The door they broke open, the fire escape ajar, was never properly secured again, a gaping, vulnerable gap in our already compromised defenses, a chilling testament to the fracturing of our fragile community, the erosion of our last vestiges of order. Eventually, inevitably, the day came when we ran out of generator fuel altogether. The volunteers had tried every trick, siphoning the last drops from abandoned vehicles, desperately searching hidden supply closets, hoping for a miracle, a forgotten cache of gasoline, but the well had run dry. And now, we faced the final evening, the final descent into darkness, with only battery lanterns and dying flashlights to light our way. A single line of overhead lights, connected to a separate, smaller battery backup, flickered intermittently, powered by the last, dying dregs of the generator's energy. It might have been more comforting to have total darkness, absolute and unwavering, than to endure the eerie strobes of those dying lights, casting jumping, distorted shadows across the gym, turning familiar shapes into menacing figures, amplifying the paranoia, the sense of unease. People gathered in tense clusters, huddling together for warmth, for a semblance of comfort, too anxious to sleep, too afraid to be alone in the encroaching darkness. Some whispered short prayers, muttered desperate pleas to unseen deities, or tried to console one another with empty words of reassurance, hollow promises in the face of impending doom. Others stared blankly at the floor, lost in despair, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes empty voids reflecting the darkness that was consuming us all. Outside, a storm threatened, the air thick with humidity, the sky heavy with unspoken menace. We heard distant thunder, a low rumble on the horizon, but no rain, just sporadic flashes of lightning that illuminated the chain-link fence in brief, stark bursts of light, painting the gym in fleeting, ghostly relief. In one such flash of lightning, as the gym was momentarily bathed in an eerie white light, I thought I saw figures pressing against the chain link, their forms indistinct, their arms outstretched, as if drawn to the flickering light, like moths to a dying flame. The silhouettes vanished when darkness returned, swallowed by the night, but the image burned itself into my mind. A chilling premonition, a terrifying glimpse into the horrors that awaited us beyond our fragile walls. Sometime around midnight, as the storm gathered strength, as the thunder rumbled closer, the generator sputtered its final breath, a last, shuddering cough, and died. The overhead lights dimmed, pulsed once, twice, casting grotesque, elongated shadows across the gym floor, and then darkness. Absolute, impenetrable darkness enveloped the gym, broken only by the trembling, inadequate glow of a few battery lanterns scattered sparsely throughout the vast space. Not long after the generator died, plunging us into the abyss, the most ominous phone alert of all, the final nail in the coffin of our fragile hope, rang out on the few devices still clinging to a sliver of battery life. Emergency alert. Immediate shelter no longer available. It repeated twice, the robotic voice devoid of emotion, devoid of hope, then fell silent, the electronic pronouncement echoing in the darkness, a death knell for our last, desperate sanctuary. The words sank like lead in our chests, crushing the last vestiges of hope, solidifying the unspoken fear that had haunted us from the beginning. Did it mean rescue efforts were officially called off? That no safe havens remained, anywhere? That we were truly, utterly alone? As if to confirm our worst fears, to punctuate the chilling finality of the alert, a new sound erupted from outside. A thunderous crash, louder than any thunderclap, the horrifying sound of the chain-link fence being hammered, assaulted, breached. The siege had begun. The final assault on our last stand. Flashlight beams bobbed frantically as volunteers, their faces illuminated by the weak light, rushed to the outer doors, pressing their ears against the cold metal, desperately trying to gauge the extent of the threat, to understand what was happening beyond the failing fence. Some survivors, panic rising in their throats, scrambled to stack chairs, tables, anything heavy they could find, against potential entry points, futile attempts to bolster our crumbling defenses. The battered door Drew's group had forced open days before, a gaping, unsealed maw in the wall, was now a glaring weak spot, a point of catastrophic failure waiting to happen. A volunteer's voice quavered in the darkness, barely a whisper, laced with pure, unadulterated terror. "They're coming." What followed was an eruption of panicked shouting, a cacophony of fear, a symphony of despair. Families clung to one another, sobbing uncontrollably, children crying, their small voices lost in the rising tide of panic. Some people ran aimlessly around the gym, like trapped animals, seeking an escape route that didn't exist, desperately searching for a sanctuary within a sanctuary that was no longer safe. The pounding on the outside walls, on the doors, on the fence, seemed to grow stronger, more relentless, a terrifying crescendo of approaching doom. It felt like the entire building shook, trembled, as if an unstoppable force was finally tearing through our last stand, breaching our final defenses, shattering our last illusion of safety. The floodgates of fear fully opened, releasing the pent-up terror that had simmered beneath the surface for days, for an eternity. A few volunteer leaders, their voices strained but still trying to project authority, attempted to maintain order, shouting for people to move to interior hallways, away from the vulnerable outer walls, while others, their faces grimly resolute, tried desperately to secure the main doors, knowing, in their hearts, that it was a futile effort, a delaying tactic against an overwhelming force. But the plan quickly fell apart, dissolving into chaos, overwhelmed by the sheer panic of the crowd, the primal terror that stripped away all pretense of order, all semblance of control. The moans and scrapings outside, the horrifying sounds of something inhuman, something relentless, grew in volume, closer, louder, and soon it felt like they were mere feet away, pressing against the doors, scratching at the windows, testing the walls, surrounding us on all sides. I looked around, seeing frantic faces illuminated by the flickering, dying glow of the lanterns, people tripping over cots, toppling them in their desperate, blind bids to flee, to escape, to simply move, anywhere, away from the encroaching horror. The old medic, Mrs. Rodriguez, her face drawn with despair but still clinging to a shred of compassion, was trying to guide an injured man, his leg bandaged and bleeding, to a safer spot, pulling him along through the chaotic crowd. But the surge of frightened survivors, each driven by their own desperate need to escape, separated them, swallowed them both in the surging panic. Meanwhile, in the flickering lantern light, across the chaotic gym floor, I caught sight of James, his face pale but resolute, leading a small group of people towards a side corridor, away from the main doors, away from the epicenter of the assault. He beckoned me over, his eyes pleading, desperate, and I forced my shaking legs to move, to follow him, clutching my backpack tight to my chest, the meager contents offering little comfort, little protection. Halfway there, through the surging crowd of terrified survivors, I felt the gym doors behind me shudder with a deafening impact, a sound that resonated through the building, a sound of metal bending, with splintering, hinges straining. Something had slammed into them, hit them hard, with a force that threatened to shatter our last barrier. The doors screeched in protest, a horrifying metallic groan that echoed through the gym, a death knell for our fragile sanctuary. Sarah appeared at my side, her face even paler than before, her eyes wide with terror but still holding a flicker of determination. "We have to find a secure room," she shouted over the rising din of panic, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't stay in the open." Nodding, wordless with fear, adrenaline surging through my veins, I followed her, pushing through the panicked crowd. Around us, families wept, children screamed, people stumbled blindly, uncertain where to go, what to do, their faces masks of utter despair. One volunteer, his voice cracking with fear, urged them towards the locker rooms, a desperate gamble for a false sense of security. But that area, I remembered with a chilling certainty, felt compromised, vulnerable, exposed after Drew's group had abandoned us, their self-imposed isolation offering no real protection, only a false promise. Another volunteer, his face contorted with desperation, was banging frantically on a locked staff office door, pleading with whoever, if anyone, was inside to open up, to offer sanctuary, to provide a lifeline in the face of the encroaching darkness. Confusion swelled, chaos reigned, and no single plan held. No voice of reason could penetrate the wall of panic. In the swirling chaos, I stuck to Sarah and James, their presence a fragile anchor in the storm of fear. We managed to guide a small cluster of terrified survivors, maybe 7 or 8 people in total, towards a short corridor at the rear of the gym, a narrow passage leading away from the main doors, away from the immediate threat. It led to a narrow staircase, spiraling upwards, a vertical escape, a desperate climb towards, somewhere, anywhere, away from the gym floor, away from the encroaching horror. We thought, with a fragile, desperate hope, that if we got higher, if we could reach the second floor, we could barricade a smaller area, create a more defensible position, buy ourselves time. A few precious moments in the face of overwhelming odds. As we stumbled down the corridor, the flickering beam of Sarah's flashlight dancing erratically across the walls, another flash of lightning illuminated the narrow passage, a brief, stark glimpse into our desperate flight. Torn posters, faded and peeling, and scattered papers, remnants of a life that felt impossibly distant, littered the ground, testament to a world that no longer existed. The walls were scuffed, stained, some bearing cryptic markings, graffiti from a time before, messages from ghosts, warnings we hadn't noticed, hadn't understood, before it was too late. We pressed on, hearts thundering in our ears, adrenaline fueling our desperate flight, each footstep echoing too loudly in the oppressive silence of the deserted corridor. Rounding a corner, breathless, terrified, clinging to a fragile hope, we discovered an office door, a solid, heavy wooden door, its surface scratched and worn, but still offering a semblance of strength, of security. A faded sign above the door read, in peeling block letters, "Coach's office." Our refuge, our last stand. We hurried inside, a desperate scramble for sanctuary, James and 2 of the other men, their faces grimly determined, helping to push a heavy, metal filing cabinet against the door, creating a makeshift barricade, a flimsy barrier between us and the encroaching nightmare. The rest of us, Sarah, myself, The remaining women and children stood panting in the cramped space, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding in our ears, the coach's office smelling musty, stale, like an old locker room, a smell of sweat and dust and forgotten dreams, a scent that now mingled with the acrid tang of fear, the metallic taste of impending doom. This is the story of survival, not of heroes or grand victories, but of the raw, desperate struggle to cling to humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. It's a story that reflects the fragility of our world, the thin veneer of civilization that can be stripped away in an instant, leaving us exposed to our most primal fears. And yet, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit, battered and bruised, finds ways to endure, to hope, to connect, even when faced with the abyss. What do you think? Did this story resonate with you? Did you feel the fear, the tension, the desperation of those survivors huddled in the gym? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that explore the darker corners of human experience, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who appreciates a chilling tale of survival. Your support really helps me keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there. You never know when the world might just decide to change the rules.